We're getting several questions from members of our after service care team about how they should process the experience of hearing someone's story of sexual abuse. After sitting through services where they've heard sermon and testimony of sexual abuse several times over the weekend, and then afterwards sitting with individuals who many of them were unburdening their own story of sexual abuse, many of them for the first time, they're finding this experience to be more sticky than they expected. This sense of unrest and discomfort, anxiety, maybe incompleteness, just continues to be a shadow over their day and their experience. And I would begin by saying thank you to the many people who were willing to show a Christ-like discomfort. Oftentimes we so emphasize the crucifixion and the resurrection of Christ that we miss what he did in his incarnation when he stepped into our sin-scarred and broken world. And part of what you did this weekend was very Christ-like as you stepped into the brokenness of somebody else's world and you allowed that to affect you. Now, one of the things that I would want to remind you, encourage you, is that you filled your role in these individuals' journeys well, and you should be able to rest in that. It is very easily when we cannot do everything that we would want to do to bring hope and restoration in the moment of that conversation, it's very easy to begin to feel powerless that we can't do anything. And so I would encourage you to know that you filled your role in these individuals' journeys well, and would invite you to rest in that. Now, one of the vibes and sometimes, unfortunately, even direct message that we can give within Christian circles is that if our faith was strong enough, we would be emotional Teflon. These things wouldn't affect us. We would not experience anxiety or unrest or a sense of being down if we just trusted that God was enough in these situations. And I think as you may wrestle with that in your own experience, your ability to sympathize with what it's like for those who've been abused to hear those kinds of messages and say, that's just hard for me in light of what I've experienced. I think your sympathy and ability to pray for the individuals that you spoke with and then the many others who were there will be greater because of your experience. Now, another thing that can be difficult is just our sense of confusion over how can God help? Based on what I heard and how awful that was and how it moved me, what can God do in the midst of that? And I think this is where we realize that within the church, we tend to be much more skilled, much more well versed at talking about how the gospel applies to sin than we are to suffering. And when you step into the world of suffering for the first time, and your primary mode of understanding how the gospel speaks is through the lens of sin, it can be overwhelming. And so one of the things that I'll include with this video is a link to a presentation that I did that just walks through how does the gospel speak to suffering. I'll also include a link to an article that speaks to that as well, that if that part for you that makes this nag and won't let go is just how does God speak to what I heard, I hope that those resources could put that to rest for you a bit. Now, in terms of just good self-care, one of the things that I would recommend for you is to realize that the more you expose yourself to suffering, the more balanced that your life needs to become. And so things like sleep, exercise, healthy diet, good amount of time for recreation, those are not luxuries that we go, I can just do without that. The more that we expose ourselves to suffering, the more those kind of Sabbath and recreational type activities where we allow God to restore and replenish us become increasingly important. Now, another thing that I would give just as a word of encouragement and admonition is don't feel guilty over enjoying life. That is an easy temptation after our exposure to suffering. Where we begin to feel like, well, why do I get to come home and enjoy the family that I have? Why do I get to come home to a safe place, whether there's a family there or not, where I don't feel threatened? What was it about? And all of a sudden we begin to reinterpret all of our current experiences in light of what we have heard from the individuals that we sat with and heard their stories. That's one of the effects of what can sometimes be called secondary traumatic stress. You didn't experience the primary traumatic stress of being abused, but through your compassion and concern for this person, you allowed yourself to be moved in such a way that some of the traumatic effects of what they experience does influence you. Now, in the midst of that, another one of those messages that you have to guard against is the sense that if I'm not still hurting, then I don't care. I might parallel that to the individual who is grieving the loss of a loved one. And the first time they begin to laugh at a joke or be amused by a television show or enjoy a song, and all of a sudden they begin to feel like, do I really love the person I lost if I can give myself to and enjoy this? And there's a sense in which, after we've heard somebody's story, that we begin to think if we're not actively hurting, then somehow we are being calloused or uncaring. And again, those are the kinds of messages that I think we have to be able to resist and go, that's not true. That's the kind of inroad that Satan would want to use to take the destruction that he brought into this individual's life and to let that magnify into my own. But even as we resist those lies and say, no, there is nothing wrong with me laughing at a good joke, enjoying a good song, enjoying a good meal, we are living in the liberty that Christ gives us, not just from sin and the consequences of that, but suffering and being dominated by the effect of it around us. Now, probably the most important thing that I would encourage you to do, and what I hope that this video facilitates more than anything else, is your ability to talk with your small group leader, if you are a small group leader, your small group coach, a pastor at our church, about the experience that you've had. I would hope that this video helps you put your questions, your emotions, your experience of this into words so that you can let somebody walk alongside of you in the same way that you were willing to walk alongside of these other individuals who came forward at the end of our services. Because this is what Galatians 6:2 is all about, where Paul says we are to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. That means as you were willing to bear the part of these individuals' burdens, that as a church that we have people around you who you should be able to put this into words and allow them to bear part of that burden for you, so that you are not alone in this. Even what Christ would say in Matthew 11, where coming to him in prayer, putting these things into words and knowing that he wants to hear from you, where he would say, come to me, you who are weary and heavy laden, take my yoke upon you because it is light. And I hope this video allows you to understand your experience better so that you can access those relationships with your brothers and sisters in Christ and even with Christ himself through prayer.